Open book: The crime story, coordinated prisoner resistance. The setup: life in the SHU. The story of coordinated resistance inside Pelican Bay State Prison doesn't begin with the hunger strikes of 2011. It begins years earlier, inside the Security Housing Unit, SHU, where men lived in a reality so bleak, so stripped of humanity, that desperation eventually transformed into rebellion. Pelican Bay was opened in 1989 as California's answer to escalating prison violence. It was built at the far northern edge of the state in Crescent City, surrounded by foggy forests and the crashing Pacific coast. The prison was meant to be the end of the line, a fortress designed not just to contain men but to break them. And at the heart of this fortress was the SHU. A cage inside a cage. The SHU was not like other prison units. In regular maximum security yards, inmates had limited contact with one another, could attend programs and occasionally saw the yard. But in the SHU, everything was stripped away. Each cell was a concrete box, about 8 feet by 10 feet. No windows to the outside world. The only light came from buzzing fluorescent bulbs overhead. A narrow slot in the steel door was the only point of contact with guards. Inside there was a concrete bunk with a thin mattress, a steel toilet sink combination and nothing else. Prisoners spent 22 to 24 hours a day locked inside these cells. Their only yard time was in small windowless concrete pens known as dog runs, barely big enough to pace in circles. Fresh air and sunlight were luxuries. The design wasn't accidental. It was intentional. Officials believed isolating gang leaders would cut them off from the outside world, disrupting the powerful criminal networks that had plagued California prisons for decades. But the reality was far darker. Indefinite isolation. What made the SHU infamous wasn't just the physical isolation. It was the indefinite nature of the punishment. Men were sent to the SHU not only for crimes committed in prison, but for suspected gang affiliation. The evidence could be thin. A book in Spanish. A drawing of Aztec symbols. A name mentioned in another inmate's letter. On suspicion alone, an inmate could be placed in the SHU for years, sometimes for decades, without ever being told when or if they would be released back into the general population. The only way out? Debriefing. To debrief meant to tell prison officials everything you knew about gang activity, to give up names, codes, smuggling routes. In short, to snitch. But to debrief was to risk death. Prison gangs had long memories, and men who cooperated often became marked targets for life. Some refused on principle, others out of fear. So they remained in the SHU, their sentences not just years long but potentially endless. Psychological torture. The conditions of the SHU slowly gnawed at the human mind. Doctors and psychologists who studied long-term solitary confinement described a host of symptoms. Anxiety and panic attacks. Hallucinations, hearing voices, seeing shadows that weren't there. Memory loss and difficulty concentrating. Depression so severe some attempted suicide. One inmate wrote in a letter smuggled out to his family, "The silence is louder than anything I've ever known. Some days I scream just to hear a sound." For some, the SHU became a place of madness. For others, it became a place of cold calculation. Men learned to communicate through vents, by tapping coded knocks on walls, or by sending kites, tiny folded notes passed hand to hand, tray to tray, until they reached their destination. Gang control behind bars. Ironically, the SHU didn't kill the gangs. It made them stronger. The Mexican Mafia, the Aryan Brotherhood, the Black Guerrilla Family, and Nuestra Familia all had leaders buried inside the SHU. Prison officials believed isolation would cut them off from their soldiers. Instead, it forced them to innovate. Orders were smuggled out in coded letters disguised as legal mail. Messages were passed through family visits. Corrupt guards sometimes carried information for bribes. Even under isolation, the gangs continued to run extortion rackets, drug smuggling operations, and coordinated hits both inside and outside prison walls. The SHU became less a place of control and more a headquarters in the shadows. The breaking point. By the late 2000s, tensions inside the SHU were at a breaking point. Men who had been locked away for decades saw no end in sight. Lawsuits challenging solitary confinement dragged through courts, but little changed. California officials insisted the SHU was necessary to fight gang violence. But prisoners saw it differently. They saw the SHU as psychological torture, a weapon used not to keep order but to crush men into submission. Letters began to circulate among inmates. Activist groups outside, like California Prison Focus and the Center for Constitutional Rights, started receiving handwritten notes from Pelican Bay. Prisoners described their conditions, compared them to Guantanamo Bay, and begged for the public to pay attention. In one letter, a prisoner wrote, "We are buried alive in concrete graves. Our only crime is being suspected. We are not asking for freedom. We are asking to be treated as human beings." It was in this crucible of despair that something extraordinary happened. Enemies become allies. In California prisons, divisions were absolute. Race, gang, and territory determined everything. The Mexican Mafia and Nuestra Familia were sworn enemies, locked in a war that spilled blood for decades. The Aryan Brotherhood fought with both. The Black Guerrilla Family clashed with all. Yet inside the SHU, men from each of these groups came to the same realization: the true enemy wasn't each other. It was the system that kept them buried in silence. Through whispered conversations, coded notes, and painstaking trust-building, leaders of these rival gangs did the unthinkable. They agreed to a truce. For the first time in California's prison history, enemies laid down hostilities long enough to focus on a common cause: resisting the SHU, the weapon of last resort. The men in the SHU had no weapons, no freedom of movement, no ability to riot or protest like prisoners and general population. But they had one thing left: their own bodies. By 2011, the idea had spread cell to cell: a hunger strike. If they refused food, they could no longer be ignored. The state could dismiss lawsuits, could censor letters, could silence advocates. But it could not ignore hundreds, then thousands, of starving men. The risk was enormous. Prolonged starvation could mean permanent health damage, organ failure, blindness, even death. But for men already condemned to live and die in isolation, the calculation was simple: better to risk dying on our feet than to rot in silence. July 2011. As the plan took shape, tension ran like a current through the SHU. Men whispered through vents, guards passed uneaten trays, and word spread like wildfire through California's prison system. On July 1, 2011, the silence of Pelican Bay broke. Hundreds of men in the SHU refused their meals. Trays slid back under steel doors untouched. By sundown, the hunger strike had begun. What started with a few hundred men at Pelican Bay would soon grow into the largest prisoner protest in California history, with over 6,000 inmates across 13 prisons joining in solidarity. And as the days stretched into weeks, the strike would test not only the resilience of the men inside, but the strength of the prison system itself. The hunger strike of 2011. The first trays slid back under the doors on the morning of July 1, 2011. Guards at Pelican Bay's security housing unit were used to men refusing meals here and there, but this was different. Dozens of trays came back untouched. Then hundreds. By the end of the day, it wasn't a protest, it was an uprising, and it was spreading. Day 1. Silence in the SHU. Inside the SHU, men sat quietly in their cells. The rumble of hunger had not yet begun, but the air carried tension. For years their voices had been ignored. Now they were betting everything on the one weapon they had left: their own bodies. Messages had been circulating for weeks through kites, air vents, and whispered exchanges in the recreation cages. The plan was simple: refuse all meals until the 5 core demands were met. The 5 demands: end group punishments for gang affiliation, abolish indefinite solitary confinement, provide adequate food and medical care, allow access to educational and rehabilitation programs, create a fair system for release from the SHU. For many, these weren't luxuries, they were lifelines. Word spread statewide. Within days, the hunger strike jumped from Pelican Bay to prisons across California. Inmates in Folsom Prison joined. San Quentin's death row prisoners refused meals in solidarity. By the second week, more than 6,000 inmates across 13 prisons were starving themselves. It was the largest coordinated prisoner protest California had ever seen. What shocked officials most was the unity across gang lines. Men who would normally slit each other's throats in the yard now starved side by side, bound by a shared cause: the human toll. By the end of the first week, the physical toll began to show. Prisoners lost 10 to 15 pounds rapidly. Blood sugar levels plummeted. Men grew dizzy and collapsed in their cells. Some reported hallucinations after just 10 days. Medical staff moved weak inmates to prison infirmaries. In letters smuggled to families, prisoners described their bodies deteriorating but their spirits unbroken. One inmate wrote to his sister, "They can starve us, but they cannot silence us. Every growl in my stomach is a scream for freedom." Families gathered outside prison gates, holding signs, chanting, and demanding Governor Jerry Brown intervene. Civil rights groups like the ACLU and Amnesty International declared the SHU conditions amounted to torture. The state pushes back. Prison officials scrambled to contain the crisis. They dismissed the hunger strike as manipulation by gang leaders. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation (CDCR) claimed inmates were being forced by shot callers to join. They described the strike not as a human rights protest, but as a gang strategy to weaken the SHU program. Spokespeople told the press, "This is not about conditions. This is about gangs trying to control prisons from the inside." To break the strike, officials threatened disciplinary write-ups, transfers, and loss of family visits. But still the trays came back untouched. The outside world wakes up. For decades, the SHU at Pelican Bay had been a secret world, largely invisible to the public. But now the hunger strike forced the nation to pay attention. Major newspapers published investigative stories. Television crews interviewed families of inmates. Human rights organizations compared Pelican Bay to international black sites like Guantanamo. Protesters marched at the state capitol in Sacramento, demanding reforms. Lawyers filed emergency motions in court. The pressure mounted daily. Inside the hunger strike. By the second week, the hunger strike reached its most dangerous stage. Bodies weakened. Muscles atrophied. Inmates fainted and were revived with water and salt packets. Some collapsed entirely and had to be hospitalized. Medical staff reported cases of kidney failure, severe dehydration, and extreme weight loss. Still, leaders in the SHU sent messages to continue. They believed breaking now would mean the state would never take them seriously again. The breaking point. By July 20th, after 3 weeks without food, inmates were on the brink. Some had lost 30 to 40 pounds. Prison doctors warned of imminent deaths. The state faced a choice: allow men to die and risk an international scandal, or negotiate with prisoners they considered the worst of the worst. Behind closed doors, quiet negotiations began. Officials offered small concessions: better food, warmer clothing, family photos in cells, and promises to review SHU policies. For men on the edge of organ failure, the choice was brutal. Continue and risk death, or end the strike with only promises in hand. The strike ends. On July 21, 2011, after 20 grueling days, the strike leaders suspended the protest. Many were too weak to continue. At least one man was reported dead during the strike. Hundreds had been hospitalized. Thousands had lost dangerous amounts of weight. But the message was clear: the SHU was no longer invisible. The hunger strike had forced California to confront the reality of indefinite solitary confinement. Aftermath of 2011. Though the strike ended, the story was not over. Officials made minor reforms but resisted major changes. Inmates accused the state of stalling and deception. Families and advocates warned that without lasting reform, another strike was inevitable. And they were right. Within 2 years, Pelican Bay would erupt again. This time with 30,000 inmates across California joining in the largest prisoner hunger strike in U.S. history. The 2013 hunger strike and the fall of indefinite solitary. The 2011 hunger strike had been a warning shot. For 20 days, Pelican Bay's SHU went silent, its concrete cells filled with starving men whose bodies screamed louder than any protest chant. The strike ended with promises of reforms, reviews, and changes to how California handled its most isolated prisoners. But promises behind prison walls are fragile things. By 2012, inmates realized little had changed. The SHU still held men in isolation for decades. Debriefing, snitching on others, was still the only sure way out. Group punishment still ruled. Inmates felt they had risked their lives only to be met with stalling tactics. And so, in the summer of 2013, they prepared to strike again. This time bigger, longer, and deadlier. The spark reignites. By June 2013, coded messages were circulating through Pelican Bay once more. The hunger strike would return on July 8, 2013. Only this time, the plan wasn't just to shake Pelican Bay, it was to ignite the entire state. Prison leaders across rival gangs, the Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, Aryan Brotherhood, and Black Guerrilla Family, reaffirmed their truce. Enemies who once spilled blood in yards now exchanged kites and promises. They had a common enemy: the SHU system itself. July 8, 2013, Day 1. When the first breakfast trays slid under SHU doors, they came back untouched. The same scene repeated across California, at Corcoran, Folsom, San Quentin, and beyond. By sundown, over 30,000 inmates across 33 prisons had joined in solidarity. It was the largest hunger strike in U.S. history. Officials were blindsided. The strike they had dismissed in 2011 as a minor disruption now encompassed almost 1/3 of California's prison population. The toll on human bodies. The strike lasted not days but weeks. By week 2, many strikers had lost 20 pounds or more. By week 4, men collapsed in their cells, unable to stand. Medical teams began reporting severe dehydration, kidney damage, and loss of consciousness. Inmates drank only water, sometimes mixing in salt to maintain electrolytes. Some chewed on ice chips to fight dizziness. Others fainted mid-sentence during letters to loved ones. Letters smuggled out described the pain. Every muscle in my body trembles. My skin is paper. My bones ache. But I will not eat until they hear us. The death of Billy Guerro's cell. On July 22, 2013, tragedy struck. Billy Guerro's cell, a 32-year-old inmate at Corcoran State Prison, was found dead in his cell. Prison officials initially labeled it a suicide. But fellow inmates insisted cell had been participating in the hunger strike. Advocates accused the state of neglect, saying his death was preventable. Cell's death became a rallying cry. Families marched with his photo, holding signs that read, "How many more must die?" The state denied responsibility, but the damage was done. Public sympathy for the strike grew, and the CDCR found itself under intense scrutiny. The state's counterattack. California officials fought back hard. They accused gang leaders of using the strike as a cover to maintain power. CDCR spokespersons claimed, "This strike isn't about human rights, it's about gang leaders trying to regain influence." To break the strike, the state transferred suspected strike leaders to new facilities, cut off family visits and phone calls, isolated inmates even further in administrative segregation. Still, the strike continued. Families and advocates rise up. Outside the prison walls, families mobilized. Mothers, wives, and children marched in Sacramento. Protesters camped outside the governor's office. Civil rights groups like Amnesty International called Pelican Bay's SHU inhumane, and compared indefinite solitary to torture under international law. One mother said of her son, who had been in the SHU for 17 years, "He hasn't touched another human being since he was a teenager. If this isn't torture, then what is?" The hunger strike was no longer just a prison issue, it was a national human rights story. The courts enter the battle. Even as bodies weakened, lawyers fought in courtrooms. A class action lawsuit, Ashker versus Governor of California, argued that long-term solitary violated the 8th Amendment ban on cruel and unusual punishment. The hunger strike amplified the lawsuit's power. Media coverage of skeletal inmates, cell's death, and families' cries put pressure on the judiciary to act. Governor Brown and the political heat. Governor Jerry Brown tried to ignore the strike at first. But as weeks turned into months, the crisis became impossible to dismiss. Legislators demanded hearings. Protesters filled the Capitol steps. Editorials blasted California's prison system as barbaric. International headlines compared Pelican Bay to secret CIA black sites. California's image was on trial. 60 days without food. By September 2013, some inmates had gone nearly 2 months without food. Over 100 were hospitalized. Dozens were placed on 4 fluids. A handful were force-fed against their will, prison doctors inserting tubes into their throats as they resisted. Medical experts warned that permanent organ damage was likely. Death was inevitable if the strike continued. The CDCR braced for a bloodbath. The strike ends. On September 5, 2013, after 60 days, the leaders announced they were suspending the strike. They cited exhaustion, the risk of death, and promises from legislators to hold hearings on SHU policies. The toll. Over 30,000 inmates had participated. Hundreds hospitalized. At least one confirmed death. It was the most sustained and widespread prisoner hunger strike in U.S. history. The settlement of 2015. The lawsuits continued, fueled by the hunger strike's momentum. In 2015, California agreed to a historic settlement. Indefinite solitary confinement was abolished. Prisoners could no longer be placed in the SHU based solely on gang affiliation. Isolation would only be used for proven disciplinary violations. Thousands of SHU prisoners were released into general population units. For many men, it was the first time in decades they walked under the sun, touched another human being, or saw the horizon. The paradox of freedom. But the settlement carried risks. By releasing gang leaders back into general population, California unleashed men who had spent decades in isolation but still commanded loyalty. Violence rose in some yards. Contraband spread. Law enforcement argued that the hunger strikes had given gangs more power, not less. The paradox was undeniable. The strikes had freed thousands from torture, but they had also reawakened dormant networks of criminal influence. The legacy of the hunger strikes. The legacy of the 2011 and 2013 hunger strikes is complicated. For advocates, it was a civil rights victory, ending decades of cruel and unusual punishment. For law enforcement, it was a security nightmare, proof that gangs could still manipulate the system from inside the SHU. For families, it was bittersweet, reunions after decades apart, but with scars that never healed. Closing reflection. The hunger strikes revealed a truth about Pelican Bay: the prison was never fully in control. Even buried in concrete tombs, gang leaders organized the largest prisoner protest in U.S. history. Pelican Bay's SHU is no longer filled with endless rows of men locked away forever. But the memory remains, a stark reminder of what happens when silence turns into defiance. As one hunger striker wrote before the 2013 protest began, "We may die in these cells, but we will not die quietly."